Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout. Today's topic is bulletproof database migrations. And I'm Ben Prezik from Barrel Strength Design and Sprout Plugins. We have with us today Brad Bell from Pixel and Tonic, who... Sorry, I hear myself on a separate screen here. All right, Brad Bell from Pixel and Tonic, and one of the lead developers on Craft CMS, and Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107, who you may know from SEO-Matic and Retour plugins, and Lindsay DiLoretto from Double Secret Agency and Smart Map, and a handful of plugins, too long to list. All right, gentlemen. The topic is database migrations. As plugin developers, we're probably all familiar with changing the schema of our plugins and needing to do something about it. So we're going to talk through all the details of that today and see what we can learn from each other in doing so. I guess to start off, I'll pose the question, when do you need a migration?
You need it when after you have already released your plugin, say, you have to make a change to your database schema. And the way to do that is through a database migration.
Great. And then what happens when, let's say, maybe from the user perspective, what happens when a database migration is necessary?
Well, in the context of Craft, I mean, migrations aren't like a Craft-specific thing, and they're not a Yi-specific thing like they've been around in other frameworks and other languages for a long time. But in the context of Craft, if a plugin releases a new migration and they have bumped their version number, then the next time somebody hits the control panel, they'll get a finish up screen, and that's when Craft knows there's a new plugin migration that needs to run, and it'll go ahead and execute any new migrations for that plugin.
All right, and when a plugin runs a migration, I think what happens is it's checking. Each plugin has a schema version in the primary plugin class, and Craft doesn't try. When Craft sees an increment in that schema version, it runs that migration, and it does what it does. If it doesn't find any errors, everything happens smoothly. Then it adds a record to the Craft migrations table saying that migration has been run and does not need to be run again.
Right.
All right, that went so smooth. All right, so then, Brad, you've told me in the past, like when you write migrations, it's the most defensive coding you do. Why is it important to write defensive code in migrations, and what do we want to happen if our migration fails?
Well, so I've kind of changed my mind on this a little bit, because like I used to think, okay, so you're writing a migration. Let's say you're renaming a column from name 1 to name 2. And then my old way of thinking would be, okay, let's check to see if name 2 exists first before we try and rename it, and that way we can prevent ourselves from getting a big SQL error in case it does exist. And usually the scenarios you see that is somebody does a Craft update and it fails somewhere, like maybe they hit max execution time, PHP memory limit, or there's some fatal error, and the update either did not complete all the migrations, or it completed them but it failed at like the cleaning up step or something like that. And so before they try again, they will forget to dump their database and restore it from the backup. And my thinking before was, well, if we're defensive, we can go ahead and guard against this, so the migration can kind of protect itself from itself. But it turns out that I think it's just much better to let the error happen. That, okay, your duplicate column exists, because you really want them to start from the previous state, like the pre-updated temp database state. Because if you guard against it, like, you're opening yourself up for all sorts of subtle bugs later that are much more difficult to track down.
And guarding against any possible scenario that could possibly take place.
Yeah, yeah. So I've kind of changed my mind on it a little bit.
Well, I'm glad to hear, because I look at our own migrations, and I was operating on that principle a little, and at times I really feel like, gosh, we're just checking for everything here, and like you said, I notice it's most necessary often in the development phase when we kind of are still refining the schema towards the new one, and multiple developers kind of have different broken schemas locally, and you didn't take the time to write the migration, or you've tried and failed 10 times. So it's you're almost defending against your own ecosystem and all of its limitations versus the live environment where people...
Yeah, in this case it's better to fail early, I think.
Okay. Well, great. Good to hear.
The system sure beats what they were doing on a recent project of mine that I was involved with, that I told Brad about, where they were just emailing each other SQL that they had to run everywhere. That was fun.
All right. Then in a moment I'll share some migration classes here and look at them. And before there, though, let's see. Maybe it's time for that, I guess. Let me share my screen here and get into what a migration looks like, maybe. All right. So here we go. Here we have I have the Craft app folder open here, and I'm looking in the migrations folder. We see a bunch of migrations that Craft has here, and I'm just going to open the first one. So our migration is a big long class name which extends base migration, and then it's this safe up method. And then a pretty common convention you'll see is a log at the beginning and the end of the migration, just to kind of signal, how far something made it in the logs.
Do you want to tell people what that class name is about? Because I remember when I first looked into it, I had no idea.
Yeah, so here in the comment, we'll see the class name is the UTC timestamp in this particular format, and then the name of the migration. Now,
and the name is just whatever you want.
Yeah, and the name, I think a convention in naming migrations is make them long and as clear as you can, and no matter how long they need to be, you want them to be, clear.
Yeah, and I think the whole goal of this name is just that we have something unique, right?
Correct. And as far as the timestamp goes, the migrations are going to run in the order of the days that they exist. So it doesn't really matter what day it is, as long as it's day or time it is, as long as it's a day and time in the sequential order of history that you want to happen. What I frequently find ourselves doing, and it looks like you might do something similar here, is there's kind of when you have a release, you might just have one day of migrations that you're running the releases for. And then we kind of just increment the time 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's less about the time and more about just the ordinal nature of the name.
Wait, you don't have it accurate up to the second for each migration?
Well, if you use the command line tool YIC, you'll get an extremely accurate timestamp there.
Right.
For you, Andrew.
I don't do that.
The problem with me is sometimes I write a migration for something I shouldn't have before I write a migration for something else I should have, and then they're out of order. And
I actually, Ben, I do it the exact same way you do, with where the date matters and the time. I kind of I leave all zeros except for the increment.
And all right, good. And then Brad, it looks like Craft is now using an underscore-based naming convention, where I believe in the docs the convention was to use kind of your plugin name in camel case, and then another underscore, and then a camel case naming convention.
Is that in the docs, really? It might be. I don't know.
Yeah, here it is. Yeah, so we have migration plugin handle, migration.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's yay for inconsistencies.
So is there a preference here? Or
I don't think so. I mean, more user preference, I guess.
one thing I have noticed is if you are using the camel case naming convention, and let's say we write sprout email or something here, and then later realize we miscapitalized it and try to rechange it, it doesn't really, you can't really do that because the migrations thinks it's new. It's new, but it's already ran, but it's in the database, or
Yeah.
I forget what error you get, but you're kind of stuck with your misspellings.
I think I would prefer, or I'd probably recommend that people go all lowercase here just to prevent yourself from, like, because some file systems are case sensitive and some aren't. Like, it'd just be probably cause less headaches if you forced everything lowercase, and maybe that's probably a better argument for using underscores there too.
All right. All right. We'll see those docs updated shortly, I'm sure.
Right.
We can all jump in. All right, so then the next question I have that a lot of us run into here, well, let's see. Shall we talk about syntax? All right, so let's jump into this question first. So in these migrations, we have a lot of different things available to us, and when you're first getting into the migrations, I think this can be confusing. If I open a few more migrations here, we might see this one is referencing this alter column, and actually I have a whole sheet of these I'm just going to pull up. So in your migration, you have access to a bunch of different things. So one is the base migration class, and it can be accessed by using the this keyword and targeting the action you want or the method you want. Another thing you have access to is just the DB connection class, which is through the service layer. So we can talk about that in a moment. But it seems to, I think it was used more in the past. I looked through the most recent batch of migrations here, and I didn't see it in use too much beyond the create command stuff. And then we have a migration helper class, which we can call on a handful of methods that kind of help out with a variety of things we might want to do. So, Brad, could you go into more detail of why is it that I can check that my table exists in the DB connection class, but I can't check if it exists in the base migration class, but I can drop the table here and I can't drop the table there? What is the roles of these different classes?
What's the reasoning? That's what you're getting at?
Yeah, what are the roles here? Why would I choose one or over the other?
Okay, well, a lot of this stuff happened over a period of time, and so there might not be like the most consistent thought behind it. But basically, like you'll notice that our migration extends base migration, which is a class that we wrote, and base migration in itself extends Yi's CDB migration. And so the main point of base migration is like we're wrapping most of CDB migration's methods just to include some audit column stuff that we're doing. And what we consider the audit columns are like the date updated, date created, and UID. So like we'll automatically like create those columns and keep date updated up to date for any plugins and all that stuff. So basically, base migration is a wrapper for CDB migration that takes into account audit column stuff, and then also does like some logging to the craft table, craft logs. Now, you'll also notice that base migration and CDB migration are also using the DB connection class, which is the main craft and Yi class for any database sort of commands. Okay. So like those are in itself wrappers for DB connection. And so when you do craft.db, like in your other doc, you're getting a DB connection object back there. So you're calling db connection.tableExist, just like base migration and CDB migration are too.
Okay. So are all of these methods so all of these methods are available directly here as well, but if we want to affect those UID and date columns and stuff, we probably want to go through this.
Yeah, those are migration specific.
Okay.
And then migration helper was like this utility class that we added because there are some things that are just painful to do in a migration, but like we found ourselves having to do it multiple times. So like renaming a table, like you can't just rename it. You have to drop all of the foreign keys and drop all of the indexes on it, and then do the rename, and then add them back with all the same names and same constraints on them. So that's kind of like what migration helper helps those, makes those complicated tasks that we found ourselves doing more than once easier.
Mm-hmm. And now why, so here's an example, rename table. It's not as simple as calling one thing. You're actually dropping foreign keys and then doing your rename stuff and then adding back those foreign keys.
Right. Kind of a pain. You don't want to, like, if you had to do that twice in 2 different migrations, like, you wouldn't want to, write that code twice. So.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and we've definitely used these as we rename. I think rename table and rename column are probably the ones I've found very helpful from the migration helper.
Yeah, and you can see, like, even in migration helper rename column, like ultimately that's still calling craft.db. Rename column. Like it's still going through the db command object.
Okay. Great. And then how are you managing? So I see in rename table and rename column, you're kind of removing the foreign keys, but you're storing them, and then you're restoring them. And then there's some other methods that might relate, like refresh, which might clear that or something. What are you storing, and does it? We recently had a migration where we were kind of running into an issue where something was getting restored that we didn't want being restored, and we had to find a way around that. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following, but refresh will basically, because like a lot of this, a lot of these database classes and like table information and column information, they're all cached, they're all memoized, because like making another, like if you have to reference it twice, making another trip to the database to get that info is expensive, and so when you want to make sure you have the latest information, you can call migration helper.refresh, and that'll clear all the caches, so the next time that it needs that info, it'll go to the database for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think when in our situation, calling refresh kind of got things working again as we needed to. But if I recall correctly, it was I wish I could say it more cleanly, but we actually had to break a single migration into 2 different migrations, because when we were trying to update something and then change something about it, it was failing. But then when we moved it to 2 different migrations and added a refresh to the second migration, then it got things working. So something about what we were doing, I don't know, wasn't happening.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great case for Xdebug.
All right. Well, we'll skip that one for now. So, all right. So we've got these different helper classes, and that, I think that helps clarify a lot of where everything's getting routed and why. So the next question then, when we do this, we are using this base migration is using the DB service layer or the DB connection service layer. However, a general rule in migrations is that we don't want to be using the service layer where possible. How do we want to think about the service layer and everything available to us in it when we're dealing with migrations?
Yeah, I think the general rule of thumb is to make make your migration as independent and self-contained as possible. So like the least amount of dependencies that a migration can have, the better. So like you definitely don't want to do things like include an active record in a migration and like use the active record to change schema, because that active record can change over time. So like the less you depend on that, and the less you depend on like calling a service, which the service itself can change over time, the interface to it can, the better. So there are some things that, like, you know, the relying on DB command, like that's probably safe enough because that's rarely going to change.
And if it changed, it'd screw you guys over as well. So.
Yeah, yeah. So like that's just kind of the rule of thumb, is to have as few dependencies as possible in your migration.
So then let's look at a case where it looks like we're choosing to break that rule of thumb. So here we have a migration for client permissions, and in this you're getting the client via the user's service, and then you're checking the permissions or doing something with the permissions through the user permissions service.
Yeah.
And saving them again. Why are you breaking from making this completely independent and beginning to use the service layer here?
I'm trying to remember if I wrote this migration or not, so I could blame it on someone else. But no, I mean this probably could have been possible just by querying the database directly. I think it's pretty safe because the chances of what get all permissions returns that it's going to change is pretty slim. So like, I don't know, like it's just you know, you got to make a judgment call. Like I feel like this one's probably pretty safe. Mm-hmm. But just like as a rule of thumb, you know.
Yeah, and I have one more here. I'll pull up so you can judge me if you want to jump.
Okay, all right, I will.
We migrate. So in the latest version of Sprout Email, we used to have a one element type for both campaign emails and notification emails, but that got complicated for a variety of reasons. So we broke it out into having an element type for campaign emails and an element type for notification emails. So this migration is actually more in the style that we discussed of probably being, I don't know if it's being a little more defensive. I feel like our migration code is the most erratic code we write. Like every time we're like dealing with some different scenario, but here we're doing kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, where we're checking to make sure things exist before we perform actions, and it does make the code a lot more verbose, I find. But one of the issues we had is, as we were migrating things over, all of the element URIs needed to get updated in the elements table and weren't getting updated. And there's a handy method to do that on the element service, update element slug in URI, and we're using that here.
Now, Ben, didn't Brad just tell you not to use the active record stuff?
Well, I don't think there's any active record code there, is there?
I'll let you judge. I didn't see any.
No, I don't think. I think he's just querying the element service and getting an element criteria model.
Okay. My bad.
Yeah. And I think this kind of leads into the bigger question of, if you're working with structures or really things that are complex as far as day-to-day schema goes, if you're trying to update something about a structure or something in the element querying stuff, you guys have done a lot of work to save us time and trouble there. And kind of rewriting that from scratch or for a single migration feels like a lot of work.
Yeah, but I mean the difference is, like, if you were to duplicate all of that logic in your migration, then like at that given time when your migration was written, this code is working fine. Whereas by offloading it to element service, update element slug in URI, which can change over time, now you're just relying on the fact that, okay, maybe I'm hoping this is going to work, you know, as things change in the future. And so, like, you just kind of have to weigh that decision, like, okay, am I okay with that, or am I going to have to
It's a bit.
Yeah, am I gonna, like, if this changes in the future, am I gonna have to make a new migration that goes through and tries to fix everything that's broken now?
So what are my options? I think this is a good. Let's say we made a dumb decision here, and you guys change that tomorrow. And what are my options as a plugin developer who's used, done something that I shouldn't have done in a migration?
Yeah, I think at that point you'd have to write a new migration that had a version check and have like different behaviors depending on the version that people were updating from and going to or something.
Or you'd have to require, you first have to update to craft 2 point whatever, and
yeah, and so
plug-in version this, and then you can run the next update.
And so we have a neat mechanism for requiring stuff like that because we did hit this like early on. So we have the ability to cut what's called a breakpoint update, which basically says you have to be on version X before you can go past it. So like we can guarantee that at this given point in time, we can assume that this code is at a certain point. And so a helpful thing, and so like plugins don't have that built in because you need like a centralized place and the plugin store, a whole different story. But a side effect of that is that it allows us to like clean out old migrations then, because like once we set a breakpoint migration, then it's safe to say that every migration in the migration folder for this user, if they're on the breakpoint migration, it has been ran, so we can just delete the whole migrations folder and start fresh again.
Nice. Now, do plugin developers have an option if they want it? Like, I agree with you. Our migrations folder is kind of annoyingly long, and we've made a few naming convention updates that we weren't able to correct.
Right.
That I'd love to just delete.
Yeah. I don't know if we've decided in the plugin store to give plugins the ability to do a breakpoint update or not. I think it's still in the air.
I mean, realistically, no one's ever going to look at the name of your migration, so.
I know, but
Yeah.
I have to, Andrew.
Okay. All right.
Lindsay, I might be way off base, but I believe I recall you asking about a way to check while you were installing a plugin if something existed before you installed the plugin. Does that make any sense?
They added, sometime in the past, like, I'm guessing like 4 or 5 or 6 months, they added something on install where, so this isn't really migrations per se.
It's not on upgrade. It's on install.
It's on install, yeah. And so there's a event for on install or on before install, I think it is, and maybe
Okay.
Brad will correct me here. And basically, if something fails during the installation, it gives your plugin an opportunity to check and make sure that certain conditions are met. Like some plugins require PHP 4 or 5.4, whereas Craft itself requires 5.3. But if so Commerce, right? So Commerce is a great example. Craft right now requires 5.3. Commerce requires 5.4, and I don't know if this is set up in Commerce, but it could easily be. It'll check the system, say, hey, you're not running 5.4, and it'll actually basically abort and not do the installation of the plugin. And I don't remember exactly the mechanics behind it, but the theory is that it would prompt you with some sort of message saying, hey, here's the problem, go fix it first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did that for some of the plugins that I wrote that required specific things. And yeah, it's on before install, and then you can return an error that will be flashed.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to check the version of Craft to make sure it's recent enough to actually be able to display that error. I think it's Craft 2.5, I think is when it was introduced. So what I do is if the version is less than 2.5, I just throw an exception, and if it's not, then I actually send them an error via the user session stuff.
Yeah, and that's good if like your plugin relies on like another plugin to be installed or something like that. Like you can do plugin dependencies that way.
I had to do it because I have a library I use that requires PHP 5.5.
Yeah.
Would
Is it?
something like that work for updates too? If there was an on before update where a plugin could just kind of check and say if we wanted to clear our migrations folder and you were updating to version 3 of the plugin, but we cleared the folder in 2.5, we could basically say you must update to 2.5 before you install 3 first as just a feedback message.
I'm like 99% sure there is an on before update event.
Ben, is this all about being able to rename your migration?
No, no. I mean, in a petty way, yes. But I think also that
Because I think we need to let that go.
on larger plugins, though, like this migrations folder gets really, it becomes a big pile. And at the very least, like when we release a 1.0, a 2.0, a 3.0, it'd be nice to clear out all the migrations from the previous version and just kind of move on and say, hey, we're looking forward now. We don't have to have a bunch of code around that's not relevant towards where we're going.
I think it's fair. I mean, I think it's fair that there would be some sort of way to have a breakpoint or clear migrations. I've seen a few plugins and plugins where the stakes are low, right? Like I think taking a stab in the dark, I think CPNav was one of them where the stakes are low. So worst case scenario, if you had to uninstall the plugin and reinstall it, minor loss, but nothing that people can't survive. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be some other plugin where you get to a point where you say, hey, look, something major is about to happen. And so I need to make sure that everyone is at this point. It's kind of like the way Brad described breakpoints. I mean, it's literally what we're talking about, is you need to be at point X before you can move to point Y. And if you're not, well, it just complicates things significantly. So while, yes, Ben would love to rename his files, I think there probably is a little bit more at stake, big picture.
Okay, but if I inherit a site at some point in the future that and I upgrade to the latest Sprout email and it just doesn't work because the migration isn't in there, I'm going to blame you, Ben.
You'll be calling the right person.
There is an on begin update, by the way, but in Craft 2 it doesn't have the perform action parameters, so if you really wanted to blow things up, you could listen to it and throw an exception or something. But I think in Craft 3 we added the is valid parameter, so you could.
Is this not documented? Because the only one I found was updates.onBeginUpdate, and that.
Yeah, that's what it just said.
Okay, but does that account for plugins as well, or is that just Craft updating?
No, they can because the parameter is type, and all plugins are going to get like a manual update from the type there right now.
Okay, I see. Gotcha.
All right, so back to this service layer question, Brad. With something like structures, I think I remember Benjamin Fleming and Andrew talking about this a while back. Benjamin was trying to write a migration that related to structures stuff and felt that it was just a lot to deal with writing manually.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you draw the line in a migration that deals with more advanced?
I don't know. I think it'd probably be like a case-by-case basis. Like structures would be tricky because there's a lot of complicated stuff going on behind the scenes. So.
What I ended up telling him was that he should have, or a way to do it would be that in his plugin, he could keep kind of his old version of the code that read that structure,
mm-hmm.
and with a versioning number in the structure or something, and on demand, as the old stuff was loaded in, convert it to the new and save it. You know what I mean? Rather than doing it all at once. In an update, but I don't know. I don't know what the best way to do it would be.
Yeah, I mean that's like I suppose if you're doing version checks and stuff in there, that'd be a way to go.
Yeah.
I think the bottom line is it's a pretty slippery slope, right? So I mean, like we're sitting here looking at this craft elements update element slugin URI, and on the surface we could all sit here and look at that and go, oh, that looks like a pretty innocuous.
Correct.
Like that's not gonna that's not going to change much. So yeah, let's go ahead and use it.
And then they get rid of the element criteria model or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or honestly, I mean, you dig into that, and maybe that's calling something else, and maybe that's calling something else, and so it's like slippery slope for sure. And I think it all goes back to like the first thing Brad said, which is the more independent you can make your migrations, the more secure you'll feel about them in the long run.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. Like, you know, dependencies beget dependencies very quickly. They're like breeding rabbits, you know, like.
Yeah, I mean, this thing's all built on top of LeftPad.
Right, right.
Yeah, because the problem that Benjamin was, or Ben F was facing was that he was talking about loading in, you know, stuff via element service and doing the actual migration of the data that was stored in there, and obviously, pursuant to what you said earlier, you don't really want to be calling all of that stuff inside of migration because it might change out from under you. So that's why I was kind of suggesting that it be done kind of dynamically on the fly.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't know what the best way to do it is, but that's kind of all we could come up with. Well, I actually told him not to worry about it too, because his plugin at the time, it was like he was worried about people upgrading from like 0.05 was the version of the plugin, and I'm like, look, just tell them to reinstall it.
Yeah.
Rules don't apply at point.
If it's before 1.0, just don't worry about it.
I totally agree with that. It's the reason you would have a pre 1.0.
Right, right. It's just understood that things can break before that. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, before we move on to workflow stuff, there's one other tool, utility available to us as we write migrations, and it is Yi CLI. let's all take a turn and pronounce this. Yi CLI.
Yick.
I would say Yi CLI, but
I just like saying yick.
so we're 50-50.
It sounds more fun to say.
So, Brad, would you be able to demo what Yick is and what it can do for us when we write migrations?
Yeah. Let me figure out how to share a screen real quick. Share screen. I guess I just picked one of these, huh?
Your favorite.
Let's go with you. Can you see that?
Yep.
Oh, sweet. Okay. So, so there's a tool called Yick, and got it in a console somewhere.
Now, I guess on the migration database migrations page in the docs, it gives you instructions on how to install Yi CLI. One thing it doesn't mention in the docs is you could alias that command to your user local bin or something so that it's globally available and you don't always have to target the command in.
Right. So by default, it's in the craft app etc console folder, and you probably have to give it execute permissions to run, which I've already done.
And Brad, we're only seeing your PHP store.
Oh, seriously? Google. How do I just share my whole window?
I think it's one of the options it's usually the option in the top left. Screen 1, screen 2.
What about that guy?
Yeah, I see myself.
All right, so there's PHP Storm, and now there's a console.
Yep.
Sweet. All right. So yeah, by default in the craft app etc console folder. Really, the only thing Yick is good for right now, and even then, it's kind of a stretch. Is generating migrations. And if you programmatically wanted to update migrations, maybe like from a command line tool or something, then you could use it for that too, instead of triggering it through the web app. But if you go just execute it, you'll see the commands it supports. base and shell probably don't work just because they were like default ones from Yi that we've probably broken. But if you do Yi migrate, you can see by default it'll check craft to see if there's any new migrations. But plugins can take advantage of this too, so let's go. I've got a test plugin on here. Let's install it. Actually, let's look at it first. So you can see just a simple plugin with one record, and the record is my test record, which will add a varchar column to the database, and with a table of craft_mytest. So when you install a plugin, Craft will go through all your records and install them and create the tables for you. So we can check database. We should have a Craft mytest table now that has a varchar my column, and we got a primary key and we got the audit columns included for us. So let's say my column was a horrible name. That was a mistake, and we want to call it my new column. There's two things you need to do. You need to update any active records with that information, and then you need to create a migration to update the actual database with that new information. So the active record would just be, let's be more clear about it, my new column. And you can, now what I do 99% of the time when creating a new migration is just copy one of the old ones, but let's say this is your first time. And then you could do Yi migrate, create, I think, and then I believe, I always get the parameters wrong here, but it's in the docs. It's description and then plugin handle. So description would be rename my column. And the plugin handle would be test. And so it asks if do you want to create a new migration in your test plugins migrations folder with a timestamp and properly formatted, yes.
Perfect timestamp.
Perfect timestamp. And so now you can see we've got a handy migrations folder that has this in it. And so we would do, migration helper, and column, and table name is my test, and old column name is my column. New column name is my column. Great. So now, you see we can reload Craft here and nothing's changed, no new migration is run. If you want to get that to trigger, you need to update your plugin schema version. 1.0.1 sounds good. You can refresh. If you click finish up, Craft will go through and run the migrations and all that stuff. But everyone knows how to do that. That's no fun. So let's change it back. If you wanted to trigger this from Yi, you could do I think there's you can get a history of every plugin migration test. It says no migration has ever been ran for test, but if you wanted to go ahead and just run them from the command line, you just do up test. Or actually, I think there's a new too, so new test. So this will detect the one we just created, and then you could just do up. And it'll go through and run it.
So basically, the Yi, these following commands are available is just a total lie, and there's all these other commands that are also available.
Yeah.
And new,
Yes. Yeah. It's not a very well thought out tool. Now, the good news is in Craft 3 that something like, there's not like a separate tool like Yik. It all goes through like the main craft index.php file, like the command line and the web, and so like it's all one and the same. So hopefully, like we're going to be able to provide a much nicer like command line experience in Craft 3.
Brad, are those chemical elements at the top of your page?
Where? All this stuff?
Yeah. All the tabs, man.
Oh, well, that's pretty low. Like usually I've got way more stuff.
God.
That's my to-do list, by the way, up there.
Okay.
Anyway, so now we can just go back and check. We can see, open up my table. What did we call it? I've already forgotten. My test. And we've got a my new column here instead. And then if you check the migrations table, you can see that plugin ID column has a reference to our plugin, and then we've got a record that it's already been executed for this schema. So that's basically it.
So then one more thing that Yik does, I think that's pretty handy, is if you added a new record to your plugin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go on.
so I think we can do that with a, let's see, what's it?
And as far as I know, this is the most convenient way to add a new record in your migration by far.
Gen, so Yik query gen, oops, totally forgotten the syntax for this, but
it is query gen all record class name.
all record class name. So record class name is just my test record, maybe. And then plugin handle, something like that.
There's not, yeah, just record class name,
Okay.
actually. Or
So it's smart enough to know that's a plugin.
I guess.
About to find out.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, this gives you the DB command syntax necessary to create whatever that active record represented. So if you had foreign keys and indexes and all that stuff defined in your active record, then it would generate it here too for you.
But did that didn't actually write the migration though, right? It just gave you the code to put into the migration.
Yeah, you can just copy and paste it from here.
Yeah, however, you pretty much just drag and drop, drop that right in between the safe up method, and you've got the majority of your migration written for creating a table.
Yeah, it's handy if you have like kind of complicated active records.
Huh, I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So okay, so then
you could probably do one for just the entry model or something, Brad, if you wanted to see like a complex one get output.
A little more involved there.
still not too bad though.
Yeah. I mean, you could type all that out if you wanted, but
So let's touch on something that Brad skimmed over a minute ago. I see this as being the biggest gotcha, the number one gotcha when I talk to people who are trying to write their first migration. You need to write the changes to the record and the migration that reflects those changes at the same time.
right.
Like, I feel like this cannot be understated. I've seen so many people say, hey, I changed my record. Why did it not change the database? Or, hey, I wrote a migration. How come my record isn't doing it? It's because you need to change the record and you need to write the migration. And the migration is basically a reflection of how you change that record and how older systems that are already using that plugin can make identical changes. And they really just need to be one-to-one if you want to walk away from this happily.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Yeah, and we see that every now and then, but I guess it comes up more in Slack and Stack Exchange sometimes. So.
Yeah, I've had at least 2 or 3 people come to me with either they wrote the migration and not the record, or they changed the record and haven't written the migration and they don't know why it doesn't work.
Yeah. Or
So
you could just not use records.
just all in the JSON blob in the plugin setting.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and here's another thing to mention, right? Is that we've been talking a lot about how a migration can alter a table, specifically a table associated with a record, right? That's most of the conversation has been about that. But let's not forget to mention that migrations can go so far beyond that. Somebody just mentioned settings. I've had to write migrations that adjust the plugin settings. I've had to write migrations that actually add a new column to the record and then do a specific calculation to then populate this new column.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've not particularly proud of this, but we've written migrations to modify the file system. So.
Oh wow. So I mean, like it's and that's a great example. Migrations. What migrations can do is almost limitless. What migrations should do should be as little as possible.
Right. So there's kind of two ends to that spectrum too, right? The one is you add a new record, which is totally fresh, and here the Yi CLI command makes it pretty easy to create the commensurate migration to add that record as well. Then there's you remove a table, which gets a little more complicated because you've got to do, if you need that data, you need to move it somewhere. Then you can write a migration that removes the table. But a lot of times it's this like shuffling stuff around and keeping balance as you're doing so.
Right.
And I don't know, Brad, if you one topic I wanted to get into here is how do we test these? I think the other pain point here is testing a migration is a little bit tedious, and maybe we could share what we do and see if we learn from each other about that process.
Yeah, well, I guess testing is one place where Yik could speed things up too, because you could just migrate up from the command line. The other thing is just it's tedious. Like you have to have a starting point for a database backup, and Xdebug comes in really handy when testing these things, just because you're blindly not executing it, seeing if it worked in the schema, and if it didn't, restoring the database to a backup and trying again. Like at least with Xdebug, you could get that down to 1 or 2 steps because like you can see what every value is at every step along the way. So I feel like that's probably the best way.
So when you run a migration, you do it with Xdebug enabled, and
yeah,
how are you comparing the values when you're using Xdebug? Because there's a lot of values sometimes, and a lot of the values are kind of settings on database columns and tables as well that you need to get right.
I don't know. What do you mean by comparing? Like making sure it's the result you're expecting?
I guess when I think of migrations, I feel the ultimate test is when I install the plugin or whatever fresh, is the database schema the same as when I upgrade from some previous system to the latest?
Oh, well, you could. If you're just comparing schema and not data, because I feel like in that scenario, the data is going to be different than on the one that migrated up versus the one you just did a fresh install on. But you can, go into like Navicat or whatever and just export the schema only, and then use something like Kaleidoscope or Beyond Compare, like some good diff tool for both SQL dumps, and you could just get a perfect line-by-line comparison of the two that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think I do something similar there.
Yeah.
So, I'm willing to kind of. Are people interested in discussing this? If I stumble through a few of the ways that I'm thinking, maybe you can just judge me.
The more stumbling, the better.
The more judging, the better.
All right, let me share. So I think it's hard to put these things into words sometimes, and easier to just make errors and point fingers. All right, so we have a migration. I think I'm going to use. We recently released a new version of Sprout Email, and so I've been working with that a lot recently. So I'm going to use that as kind of the test case here. But so as in this version of Sprout Email, we had a lot of migrations. We had 10 different migrations we did for various things, and I don't know, maybe they didn't need to be broken out into 10. It just kept them smaller and easier to work with. So as Brad mentioned, when you run a migration, everything gets added to this migrations table of what was ran. So if you're testing a migration and you don't know if you have the syntax right yet, and you've run the update, you can't just change something in your file and rerun it, because nothing will change, because Craft will think that the migration has already run. So let's see here. I'm on Sprout Email. I'm on the latest version of Sprout Email, and let's just say I was tweaking. So one way to trigger a new migration, like trigger the migration again, is I just come in here or to the database and either increment the schema version here, or just in the database plugins table decrement the version number here. Doing either of those things would kind of trigger Craft into thinking there's another update to check for. And then, but when we refresh here, I don't think we get anything, or nothing will happen. Maybe it will trigger it, but nothing will actually happen, because the migration that I'm trying to tweak and change is already registered as it has been run.
Yeah, if you were to click finish up here and then check the log files for the update, the log files will show that there are no new migrations for Sprout Email.
Mm-hmm. So then if I wanted to, say, rerun this particular migration, I could come in here and delete this row. Say I really want to just rerun this. I'm going to tweak my version number, come delete this row, and then I'm going to hit update, and then I'll at least get to rerun the migration I'm testing right now.
Right. But depending on what that migration does and how defensively it's been coded, like you may get an error here since the changes have already made. So
because if the table exists, if you already created or deleted a table or something, you can. So this is, I don't know. I think it's worth looking at this way because it's clumsy and kind of, I don't know. It's I don't know where your fingers go sometimes when you just want to get something done and you're playing with it. So a better way to do this might be you actually uninstall your plugin. I guess. Please, I know, I feel that I'm fumbling around with this workflow, so don't hesitate on judging me on this. So, and being like, why are you doing it that way? So another way to do this is we uninstall the plugin, and we manage our plugins in Git, I think like many people do, and we create a branch actually for every version of the plugin that we release. So if I want to move back to the last version of Sprout Email, I could just switch branches, and now when I hit the install button for Sprout Email, I'm going to be installing the last version of the plugin.
Is there a reason you do that with branches as opposed to tags? I'm just trying to see if there's a advantage.
It was easier to do the switching like this, I think. With tags, you might have to create a branch from the tag if you want to switch to the new branch.
Okay. No, I mean you should be able to just go to the tag's a commit. So anyway, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, I would expect you can do the same workflow with tags we're using.
I just thought there might be something I was missing, but anyway, keep going.
All right, so we install fresh. I just didn't refresh the page, but we're installing 2.3 for Sprout Email right there. And so now if we want to perform that update again, we can go back to our branches here and switch back to 2.4, and then just refresh the page, and we're going to trigger that migration again and get the update. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of the clumsy workflow that I find us doing. And then the
I
way
don't think it's bad though, because I mean, and I do something similar, because you really kind of want to do it the way a user is actually going to be doing it, right? I mean, I realize that in theory there are other ways you could do it, but it's somehow I feel more comfortable that I have done exactly what some user is going to end up doing.
Yeah, and sometimes we'll jump back to a handful of older versions too, and you can kind of do that same process to make sure that some other thing isn't introduced.
Yeah, so what we'll do, like, because we have the luxury of a breakpoint update, so every new release, we always test back to the last breakpoint update, which for us was like 2.1, 2.1.1570, something like that. Because like anybody before that, we know they have to get to that. And so we know, like, generally that's a pretty safe update. Like, nobody is complaining about updating to 2.1.1570 anymore. But for all new releases, we want to make sure that we didn't break anything all the way back to that last breakpoint. So
when you say the last breakpoint, you mean the first breakpoint?
No, the last breakpoint.
I guess the last breakpoint, the first migration of that breakpoint. I guess there would be no migrations if you're going all the way to the breakpoint.
Right.
I just talked myself in circles. I gotcha.
So Brad, do you use branches or tags, or something?
So we use so we have under release, we have dev, stable, and beta, and then we have dev branches that are of the specific versions.
Okay.
But like because of our auto update process and like generating patch files, and like we have these separate repros that get tagged and stuff, so we can generate deltas between releases, and so it's a little more complicated.
Okay. All right. And then when you test back to the last breakpoint, do you test every single version that happened, or do you just kind of
No, it's usually
you test the last breakpoint to the latest, and everything will work in between?
Yeah, I mean, generally, like, unless we have a specific reason, we'll test the last breakpoint, the last release, and then the new release to make sure it installs.
Okay. And so in our case, since we don't have breakpoints in plugins, I should probably be testing all the way back to 1.0 or whatever our first supported version was.
Yeah, I mean, it's good because you can catch stuff before users find it and complain about it. So
yeah. Okay. So then we just upgraded in this example. So I'm going to jump back to my database here, and so now we kind of have this question of, well, how did that go? Didn't get any errors, but is the database schema the same as a fresh install? And maybe there's a better way to do this, but one way I've found to do this is you can, in SQL Pro at least, select all of these tables and right-click and say copy create syntaxes, and then just kind of dump them here. And so these are the schemas of all your tables as far as the database is concerned.
And do you actually check these each time you do a migration?
Yeah, and so then...
You're making me feel bad. I don't do anything.
Then we'll
if I had installed it and it works, I assume it's right.
Well, Andrew, sometimes, like this last one, we changed a ton of stuff, and so I was a little worried that we would break something. If it was just a one record thing, I mean, it would be easier if it was just one record or column here or there.
Yeah, if it's a huge change, then I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, and so then I would come and uninstall this again, and then make sure that I'm on the latest 2.4 version, and then reinstall it. Sorry, this is wildly exciting to watch in process of. This is usually best done while watching a movie or something as well, I reckon. And then we can kind of refresh our schema, and then I've tried to copy all of the table, create, and get the same, but then I'll kind of take each one of these and actually just find and search for it. And if I find it, I'm like, great, delete it. That one's a good one, and then I'll go to the next one and copy that and like find that one.
And I would
And
not
so,
recommend doing this while you watch a movie. You're gonna miss the whole movie.
well, it depends what the quality of movie you like, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a little above and beyond my process, but I will say, like, even some of my more intense migrations probably don't compare to this Sprout one you're showing us, this email one that you're showing us. But I have had some intense migrations, but even then, my basic workflow is I make a little snapshot of an export of the database, and I say this is my rollback point. And then it's basically trial and error, and this is where Brad would say, but PHP storm and Xdebug. But me being kind of old school, I'm just kind of, it's very much like a trial and error. It's like, hey, and I also try and sort of work through the migrations piece by piece. And one thing that I've done, I've actually found this to be pretty helpful, is you'll have, so you have a migration file and you have your safe up method, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've found to be helpful is instead of just jamming everything into safe up, I segment it out into the little chunks of like, oh, I need this to happen, I need this to happen, I need this to happen, and I make those all methods inside the migration file, and they're the private underscore methods, and then my safe up just becomes a list of those. Like, first it's going to do this, then it's going to do this, then it's going to do this. And I find that makes it a little easier to troubleshoot and narrow down exactly where the problem is and make sure it's not interfering with everything else, and just make it a little bit more modular for the sake of testing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lindsay, I can understand why you wouldn't listen to Brad's advice. It's not like he knows how to do. It's not like he knows how to do any of this stuff.
Yeah. What did this noob know?
I'm learning all this the first time myself.
So I have a few miscellaneous questions, Brad. One is, so by default, all of these migrations return true at the end. Do you ever return false in a migration? Does returning false like just abort it or?
No, I'm pretty sure. Well, I have to look at migration service. So migration service. Run to top. We'll check for new migrations, and then. Yeah, so if it equals false, then Craft will log that migration failed, but it will continue to it'll bail at that point, because if one fails, like, what's the point in doing the others? So.
Okay.
Yeah, because if it fails, the thinking is you pretty much have to roll back.
Yeah, because like maybe there's a migration after that relied on the schema of the one that failed, and
So when we're writing migrations and we do something wrong, what do we want our code to be doing? One, maybe logging where we got to in the logs, so that somebody could say, hey, something broke, help me. But then the other is we want to be returning false or failing some way, so that Craft actually gets triggered to reinstall the last version of the database and start fresh.
Right. Yeah. So like extensive logging is very helpful in debugging like failed, like why migrations fail, especially if they're complex. Just throw as many craft.logs in there as necessary to help figure out why it failed. And then if there's some just completely non-recoverable, non-exception-based error, then you can return false to a halt. Like you can programmatically halt the whole process then if for some reason you wanted to plug in.
Mm-hmm.
I remember some migration I was doing, and I don't remember if it was an error in the SQL or just a typo in the migration, but I remember like nothing happened. And I was like,
probably registered in the migrations log already.
What the hell? Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. All right, then I guess here's another pet peeve question of mine. Let's say I didn't check things enough and I put the columns in the wrong order. And so I have like, when I have a fresh install, like I get my columns of some record in one order in the database, but when I do a migration, like it doesn't add a particular column after another one. And it just feels shady if you look at the database and doesn't feel organized. Is there any hope?
I think I think the real answer there would be get over it.
Well,
right?
I mean, I'm over it, but I'm also asking. But I mean, look at a database. It's nice to feel like you're looking at something organized. And
I'm OCD enough to actually agree with that. But so the good news is while the real answer is get over it, I actually have the same OCD. But Craft is kind enough to provide add column before and add column after. So really, it's just a matter of capitalizing on those methods.
I need rearrange columns after the fact, though. Is there?
Well, so those and the funny part is, like, we're OCD enough that those weren't actual Yi methods. We added those because it was annoying to have columns out of order.
Right? Nice.
So yeah, you can utilize, like, you can, drop the old one and then use add column after to put it wherever you want at that point.
So would you have to write the new column, copy the data over, and then drop the old one?
Yeah.
Okay. So you would have to even write the new column with a different name, copy the data over, and then rename
it. You'd have to take care of any indexes or foreign keys to, like, if we were super OCD, we could add something to migration helper that wrapped all of that up.
Yeah, move column to new location.
Yes. If you really want to, Ben, you can write your sock drawer rearranging migration. I actually had to do this for something where it would drop one table, and what I did was I just added a new table, copied the data, renamed it, and then dropped the old one, exactly like you're talking about. And I just remembered what it was that if you have a syntax error in your migration PHP file, it's not that it does nothing. What it does is it says it can't find the migration. And that was driving me nuts for quite some time, trying to figure out, I'm like, they're named the right thing. And it ended up just being a syntax error in my PHP in the migration.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's saying it can't find, then the error message is actually just wrong, right? Because it can find it. It's just finding a version with an error.
I guess. I mean, I don't know. That's what was happening.
I've never had a syntax error, so I don't know.
Ever.
I mean, me either. This is actually a friend of mine that this happened to.
Yeah, asking for a friend.
Yeah.
All right, here's one more. This is the end of my laundry list. So what happened? So we renamed elements in this last migration, and those when you create a field layout, the field layout column has, what is it? Craft field layouts has a type, of which the type is the name of the element or something like that, I guess.
Okay.
When we renamed our elements, we had a migration and realized that the value of our old elements was present in this field layouts table, so we updated it to the name of the new elements. But then we later learned that the old elements just still are there with the old names in them, and it seems that we can just change these names to whatever we want, and nothing gets affected by them. And I don't know. If this is too specific, we can table it. But the broader question is, how do we know where else in Craft we should be updating things, and are we just going about this wrong? I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that's just like a matter of being familiar with the database architecture, and if, like, in your case, that'd probably be something like if it's still an issue, like, send it to support, and we can figure out what's going on. But
it's less an issue as it is just I don't understand it. I don't know why the ones are still there, and if we're not cleaning them up properly, because they don't. I don't know. Sometimes I feel Craft just has records of old stuff. Like, even when you delete a field or something, doesn't the field stay in the? Maybe not when you delete a field.
It stays in the content table.
Yeah, it's like sometimes there's just data in craft because you folks are kind of trying to say like, oh, if somebody changes their mind, we'll be there for you. But I don't know if it's something I should be deleting or not.
Yeah, I actually mulled over, writing something like that would clean out not just that, but also the revisions, because I think the revisions go on indefinitely, right, Brad?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's been a feature request for a while, like to provide a way to better manage the revision stuff. So
yeah, because your database can just get monstrous if you have people that are making constant revisions to stuff.
yeah,
But yeah, it does. If you delete a field, all the data for the field will still be there, which normally is really helpful, right? Because if someone uninstalls a plugin and then reinstalls it, all the data will still be there. Or if you change your mind, like you said, Ben, and you remove a field and then you add it back, it's kind of magically still there, which again normally is very helpful. But you could write a plugin called, I don't know, OCD tidy or something. Go in and really remove anything that's not actually being used, I guess.
Yeah, I think my biggest fear is just like if you're, and maybe it's just knowing which, if you're not using the service layer, you need to understand more than what you're just accessing the database directly and deleting stuff. You kind of need to know what the service layer was doing that you also have to recreate, and sometimes that's a pretty big task when you're just trying to do a small thing. You have to get kind of familiar with this whole separate side of the system that you never
right.
I guess the idea is that disk space is cheap, right? And
yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, like renaming an element type isn't necessarily a small thing either. So, like,
yeah,
that's pretty involved.
Yeah. So I mean, disk space is cheap, and no one is going to do like a TV show on DB hoarders or anything, where they're going to come in and look at your database and go, oh my God, look at all this stuff that he has in his closet,
Mm-hmm.
So it probably doesn't matter a ton from that perspective. I will say that one thing that took me a while to kind of figure out was when I was first doing the migration was how to map from attribute types in Craft to the actual column types that needed to be used for the database migration stuff. And I guess it's still just a matter of plumbing through the files, right?
Yeah, and Craft 3 has gotten rid of a lot of that magic with attribute types and stuff. So, like, you've got much more fine-grained control from your record of how the schema gets created without going through this whole other layer of attribute type stuff.
Yeah, because I remember I would have a particular craft attribute type, and then I would need to change something with it later on, and I had to go digging around to find, okay, well, what column type should this actually be?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys, Lindsay, I think I remember talking with you about this when I was asking for some help on it, but I don't know if you guys have kind of struggled with that either, but at least it wasn't initially clear.
One of the, aside from being like just another thing that a developer has to learn, there was a pretty significant performance overhead with all of that magic too. So like just getting rid of that and going back to like basic Yi definition syntax significantly improved performance around records and models and stuff.
Great. So then we make these changes, our migrations all work, but one final topic I wanted to bring up is deprecation errors. Sometimes we change stuff that we don't want around anymore, and we might get through the schema changes, but then deprecations, I guess they're outside of the specific migration, but they are something you need to be thinking about as you go through this process.
Yeah, so hopefully you're following something like semantic versioning and you're only making breaking changes on major releases. But in the meantime, you find something you want to get rid of, and so you can use Craft has a deprecator service, craft.deprecator.log or something. I forget the actual method. But you can put that inside whatever method you're looking to get rid of, and then if there's any code calling it, you'll get a notice in the control panel that so-and-so is deprecated, you know, the message can say you need to fix this by, you know, craft 3 or craft 4 or whatever. And then by the time that new one comes out, you can, hopefully everyone's had ample time to fix their code, and then you can go ahead and remove the method altogether. That's kind of like the safe way of getting rid of old code without making unexpected breaking changes.
And that deprecation logging works for any situation where the action that's happening passes through a method.
Right.
I guess. And so so what happens if you make change? What are your recommendations for handling changes that happen outside of that? Say a CSS class change, or one we ran into recently with this changing of elements is previously we had when we created an email element, in the template you could refer to it as entry, and it was a decision that was made because we were trying to be similar to how Craft was handling entries and all this. It was a terrible idea. Not only were the emails named entry, the integrations with entries were named entries, everything was named entries, and it just it was unclear like what was happening like throughout the entire code base because of this decision. And refactoring this was a very big thing. But so now we're saying, now in your template, you're no longer accessing the entry variable. You're accessing something we're providing to you that's now an email variable. And as far as I can tell, there's no way to deprecate a variable that's available to the page. We kind of have to have a separate way of, if you're using this in your page code, please run through it and update.
Isn't it just going to break now anyway?
Well, I mean, so right now we're providing both variables to the page until we up the version to the new. So we started providing the new version. We've updated the documentation to refer to the new version. We still provide the old version so we don't just completely break everybody's install. But ideally, we remove that, or maybe we never remove it. You guys still have BLX as a namespace,
right? Old school. Yeah, I don't know, like maybe for the Twig one, maybe you could have a plugin that registered its own template loader or something, and then that extended crafts, and like you could do something fancy and check if that variable is defined in the context of your plugin or something, and then log a notice. I don't know. For CSS, I have no idea how that would work. I don't even know how you
apply some horrible style to the CSS.
Just start blinking it.
Yeah, they'll notice.
Yeah. I actually noticed that one more in the craft control panel. Now and then I'm doing something and I'm like, that doesn't look right. Oh wait, there's a new CSS style there that we aren't using.
Yeah.
I never knew of before. So,
all right, I want to throw something out here, and I already kind of know the answer to this, but I feel like Brad needs an opportunity to say this on camera.
Uh-oh.
So there is obviously a safe up method. Why is there no safe down method?
It's not safe.
It's not safe.
Yeah, it's wrongly named. It's like saying Best Buy is the actual Best Buy, you know, like, or the website gets satisfaction, like anyone ever got satisfaction from that website. So it's for your own sanity. Like, in theory, with a migration, you can migrate up as well as migrate down, and as a plugin developer, you would have to write the opposite code of your migrate up that undid everything you just did in migrate down. Okay, it sounds simple enough.
Just change the letters.
Yeah, right. Just do RTL on it. But the problem comes like from supporting that, and say you've got and with tools like Yik, you know, like you want to Yik migrate down like three migrations ago, and those migrations might not even tie to like a specific version of the plugin. So like in Ben's case, email had 10 migrations, and if someone said Yik migrate down 3, now you're in this weird state that the plugin isn't expecting. And let's say you had plugin A that was depending on the schema version of plugin B, and then someone migrated down plugin B, and now like there's all sorts of version dependency problems. So it's more of a support thing than anything. Like if somebody migrates down Craft, but you've got plugins that are dependent on like the latest version of Craft, and they've made the assumption that Craft's already up to date. Like maybe they're doing a version check in their installer, and that's the only place they're doing it. But you migrate down Craft, and now they have no idea because they're already installed. Just all way too many headaches. That's why we don't support it.
And not to mention, it could be destructive to data as well.
Yeah.
You add a column, people populate that column, and then you migrate down and destroy that column.
Right.
You create more problems than you solve.
Yeah. So.
Well, and we always want to be making progress, right? We don't want to be going backwards. It sounds to me like safe down really should be like restore from backup. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That would be the safest way to actually just restore from a backup.
Well, what I mean is if anyone actually does want to downgrade, right, the answer is restore from some older backup that you have.
Right.
It's also extremely rare that you have a good cause to migrate down. Like what is the use case for that other than some really random testing?
Hey, wait, you're the one that asked.
No, it was a hypothetical. Like I said, I already know the answer. I feel like
Nothing's
it
wrong
needs
with
to be
moving to Australia.
Yeah.
You just disenfranchised all of our Australian viewers by essentially calling them backward, Ben. Okay?
Hey, only because they go skiing in the summer.
And they're also a day ahead of us, so be careful what you say, Ben.
They'll never hear this then.
Are you gonna region restrict it?
No. If they're ahead of us, it happened in the past.
They missed it.
It's already passed. Yeah.
Yeah, they went on to Saturday while we're still having this chat.
Oh, God.
All right. Any final questions?
I do have just one small thing to add. So my understanding is that, Brad, in Craft 3, there actually is a special migration for when plugins are first installed?
Yeah, it's so instead of, and this may change, so don't like take it for word, but instead of plugins, instead of Craft installing plugins based on active records, there's like a special install migration that Craft will use. And so plugins are now responsible for creating this install migration for installation, basically.
So, but that's not set in stone?
Yeah, like the mechanics of it may change, but the general principle is there.
Okay.
What is the reasoning behind that? Why have a separate migration just for an installation?
Less magic. Like one of the big things of Craft is like take out a lot of the magic that's that people would have to learn on like if you could just learn like the fundamentals of Yi2 and not have to like learn all of these extra magical things that Craft does on top of Yik, then it's clear. There's lots more Yi documentation to figure things out. The Yi developer crowd install base, like then they natively start knowing this stuff. And so, there's lots of benefits to it.
Interesting.
Yeah, that actually makes sense to me because I did kind of encounter that where Craft kind of kept me insulated from the underpinnings of Yi to some extent until I got into certain aspects of it. And then I was like, holy crap, what is this?
Yeah.
So having that be consistent actually makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's going to be much more in line with a Yi way of thinking. Craft 3 is so.
Good to know.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you for coming out and joining us today, Brad. It's been fun.
Yeah, yes.
And Andrew and Lindsay. I think we got to cover most of the things that you're going to get to run into with migrations. I'm sure there's more we'll discover.
Yep.
And everyone buy lots of licenses of Craft, because as you can see, Pixel and Tonic can't even afford to buy their employees chairs. Okay?
No.
Is Brad just sitting on a milk crate?
No, the guy behind him.
I've been squatting the whole time.
All right, great. Well, a few notes on a few administrative notes before we wrap up. We next, I'm not sure, in a couple of weeks, Aaron Berkowitz will be joining us to talk about craft-powered apps. He's been working on a handful of PBS Kids apps, which are pretty cool. So we have that on the roster.
I thought you were having Son of Sam on.
Who's
The serial killer. It's David Berkowitz, though. Never mind. It's a different one. Go ahead.
Almost
All
the
right.
same. One makes PBS Kids apps, the other one murders people.
It's pretty close, really. Pretty much.
We will continue on a weekly basis here at Straight Up Hangouts, but it is hard to keep up with the weekly cadence. So we might do a few. We might try a few different things with something like in the past we've done a Stack Exchange 0, where it's less about a recorded hangout and more just an hour of time where we're answering questions on Stack Exchange, craft-related stuff. Still focused on learning and improving our craft skills. Maybe just a different format that's a little easier to schedule for in the weekly cadence. We'll let you know. And Straight Up Hangouts has been a presentation by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Thanks for coming out. We'll see you next week.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Later.